Imagine the northern Great Plains in the dead of February. Not a romanticized winter, a killing one. Air temperature locked at -35 degrees Celsius. Wind driving across open, treeless land at 20 miles per hour, pushing the cold through every layer, every gap, every breath. Wind chill drops to -50. The ground has been buried under snow for 4 months already, and it won't see bare earth again for 2 more. This isn't a cold snap. This is half a year of winter so total, so absolute, that exposed skin freezes in minutes, and the wind never, not once, stops moving. Now consider what it would take for a modern person to survive here. The best sleeping bag money can buy, rated to -40 degrees. A 4-season tent, engineered for alpine conditions. A propane stove to generate heat on demand. With all of that, with every advantage modern technology offers, a trained winter camper begins losing ground within 6 hours. By hour 8, hypothermia becomes likely. By hour 12, survival becomes uncertain. The best gear humanity currently produces buys you half a day. After that, the cold wins. Hold that thought, because here is what the historical record actually shows. Entire communities, not soldiers on a mission, not explorers chasing glory, but families, children, elders, entire societies lived on this land. Not survived it, lived in it. Generation after generation, through winters that lasted 5 months, in structures built from materials the land itself provided. And the European fur traders who visited these communities in the 1830s didn't write about suffering. They didn't write about endurance, or hardship, or the grim determination of people clinging to life at the edge of the possible. They wrote about having to remove their coats, because the interiors were uncomfortably warm. That detail is not a footnote. It is the entire question. These were men who knew cold, who had crossed the Atlantic, who had spent winters in stone buildings with massive fireplaces, who had no reason to flatter the people they were trading with. And their honest reaction to stepping inside a structure made of buffalo hide and wooden poles was to reach for their collar and loosen it. That is not survival. That is climate control. So here is what this episode is not about. It is not about primitive people enduring hardship through sheer toughness. It is not about noble suffering or romantic notions of living close to the land. What it is about is engineering. Specific, sophisticated, empirically refined engineering that solved a problem modern technology still throws money at without fully solving. Today we spend hundreds of dollars on REI gear to simulate the warmth that people built from hide, earth, and bark. And our gear runs out of fuel, breaks down, and fails to outperform what came before it. The question worth asking is not whether their systems worked. We know they worked. The question is what they understood about heat, about air, about the physics of cold, that somewhere along the way, we forgot. To answer that, we're going inside 3 structures: a tipi on the open plains, an earth lodge buried in the ground, and a longhouse stretching 200 feet through the eastern woodlands. 3 different peoples, 3 different solutions, and one principle threading through all of them that will change how you think about warmth, about shelter, and about what it actually means to be intelligent. Because survival was never the goal, comfort was. And comfort, it turns out, has always been an engineering problem. Look at a tipi, and your instincts will tell you it cannot possibly work. A cone of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles, open at the top where smoke escapes, gaps at the bottom where the hide meets the frozen earth, and a fire pit sitting exposed in the very center of it all. Cold air enters from below. Warm air exits from above. Every basic principle of heat retention seems to be violated simultaneously. If you handed this blueprint to a modern engineer and told them to evaluate it as a winter shelter, they would hand it back and tell you to start over. And they would be wrong. Reginald and Gladys Laubin lived year-round in tipis across Wyoming through the 1950s and recorded what actually happened inside. On nights when outside air sat at -35 degrees Celsius, interior temperatures held between 10 and 15 degrees above zero. That is a temperature differential of nearly 50 degrees, maintained by hide walls and a fire smaller than most modern campfires. That is not primitive survival. That is performance equivalent to a modern insulated home. The question is how a cone of animal skin achieves what glass fiber and engineered foam struggle to match. It begins with the fire, and the fire begins with a counterintuitive rule. Keep it small. Not roaring, not impressive, not the kind of fire that makes a good photograph. 12 to 18 inches across. Fed steadily. Never allowed to grow large. Never permitted to collapse to ash. A Tipi fire consumed roughly 1/4 the wood of a frontier cabin fireplace while heating the space more effectively. The logic inverts everything we assume about warmth. We build large fires and let them burn down, creating a boom and bust cycle of heat that exhausts fuel and swings the interior between too hot and too cold. The Tipi approach maintained a small, constant flame that produced steady, manageable heat with modest fuel consumption. Size was never the point. Consistency was. The placement of that fire was not ceremonial. It was geometric. Dead center, always. Dug 6 to 12 inches below floor level. Heat radiates equally in all directions from a central source, meaning every point on the circular perimeter receives the same thermal energy. Move the fire toward one wall, and you create hot zones and cold zones. Keep it centered, and the entire volume heats evenly. This is basic physics, but it required someone to understand it, test it, and build a culture around it. Now consider what the smoke hole at the top was actually doing. It looks like a fatal flaw, a chimney that drains all your hard-won warmth into the night sky. But attached to that opening were 2 adjustable flaps, extensions of the hide, supported by external poles that could be repositioned continuously. On a still day, the flaps sat open slightly, and smoke rose out freely. But when wind moved across the plains, and wind always moved across the plains, those flaps transformed the opening into an active draft system. Wind passing over the apex created a zone of low pressure through the Venturi effect, the same physical principle that generates lift over an airplane wing. That low pressure zone pulled smoke upward and outward with force, actively ventilating the interior without any mechanical assistance. The Wright brothers would formalize this principle in 1903. The Tipi had been using it for centuries before that. The liner completed the system. A separate wall of hide hung 12 to 18 inches inside the outer cover, running from the ground to roughly shoulder height, creating a sealed pocket of still air between the 2 membranes. Dead air, air that doesn't circulate, is one of nature's most effective insulators. The liner was, in functional terms, a double-pane window made of buffalo hide, wrapping the entire living space. But it did more than insulate. Cold air entering at ground level moved inward along the floor inside that liner, drawn toward the fire's oxygen demand. Meanwhile, warm air rose along the outer wall, radiating heat back inward before escaping through the smoke hole above. The result was a controlled convective loop. Cold air coming in low, feeding the fire, rising as heated gas, warming the interior on its way up and out. The architecture didn't resist air movement. It choreographed it. Sleeping areas were raised 6 to 12 inches above the floor on platforms or thick layers of buffalo robes. Not for comfort, for physics. Cold air is denser than warm air and pools at ground level. The sleeping zone sat above that cold layer, in warmer, stratified air. And the cone itself was not symmetrical. The rear wall stood steeper than the front, tilting the smoke hole slightly forward of the fire. This prevented downdrafts from pushing smoke back into the living space. Wind striking the angled rear wall deflected upward, generating additional draw. The geometry itself created draft that a vertical cylinder never could. Now close your eyes for a moment and place yourself inside that structure. You are 6 years old. Outside, the wind is driving snow across a landscape that has not seen bare ground in 4 months. The temperature is something that kills exposed skin in minutes. But inside, where you have slept your entire life, it is warm, not survivable. Warm. The fire is small enough that you could almost step over it, but it has been burning steadily since before you woke, and it will burn steadily until long after you sleep. You have never known cold inside these walls. You have never needed to, because every element of this structure, the liner, the flaps, the geometry, the placement of the fire, is working together as a single integrated system, each component amplifying the others. That is not a tent. That is a home built on a complete understanding of how heat moves through the world. They didn't fight the wind, they hired it. If the Tipi's answer to winter was to outthink it, to redirect cold air, to choreograph heat, to turn the wind into an ally, then the Earth Lodge's answer was something more fundamental, more ancient, more absolute. The Earth Lodge didn't compete with winter at all. It simply disappeared from it, and to understand how, you need to understand one fact about the ground beneath your feet that most people never think about. 4 feet below the surface, the soil maintains a constant temperature of 10 to 13 degrees Celsius. Not in summer, not in winter, always. It doesn't fluctuate with weather. It doesn't respond to wind chill or blizzards, or 6 weeks of unbroken cold. It simply holds, stable and patient, because soil has thermal inertia so massive that the seasons above cannot reach it. The Earth Lodges built by the Mandan, Hidatsa, Pawnee, and Arikara peoples were not shelters placed on the ground. They were shelters built into it, structures that borrowed the planet's own thermal reserve and called it home. These were not small or temporary structures. Earth Lodges stretched 30 to 60 feet in diameter. A single building housed 10 to 30 people, extended families spanning 3 generations, living and sleeping and weathering 5 months of continental winter under one roof. Construction began by excavating 2 to 4 feet below ground level, planting massive cottonwood posts, a full foot thick, as central supports, then spanning heavy beams between them and radiating lighter poles outward to form the dome's framework. Over that frame went layers of woven willow branches, then a foot of prairie grass thatch, then 6 to 12 inches of packed earth and sod. From the outside, an earth lodge looked like a low hill. From the inside, it was a cave that breathed. And what that earth covering represented was not just insulation. It was a thermal battery of enormous capacity. Here is how the battery worked. During the day, the fire burned in its central pit, steadily, modestly, in the same manner as the Tipi fire, small, constant, sustained. That heat didn't just warm the air inside. It was absorbed by the tons of earth overhead, stored in the mass the way a brick wall holds warmth long after the sun has moved. Then, as evening came and the fire dimmed, that stored energy began radiating slowly back inward. Temperature inside the lodge dropped, but gradually, 10 to 15 degrees over 8 hours, rather than plummeting the moment the flame reduced. The earth didn't just surround the structure, it participated in it, acting as a slow-release thermal reservoir that bridged the gap between fire and dawn. Modern earth-sheltered homes use this identical principle and reduce their heating costs by 50 to 80%. The engineering is not new, it is ancient. We simply forgot it and had to rediscover it. The entry system solved a different problem entirely. Rather than a door opening directly into the living space, earth lodges had tunnels, passages 10 to 20 feet long that extended outward and downward from the main structure before turning upward into the interior. This design was not ceremonial, and it was not architectural preference. It was physics made physical. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. A tunnel that descended before rising created a trap at its lowest point where the coldest, heaviest air pooled by its own weight and could not flow upward into the living space. Wind could howl across the plains at 20 miles per hour, but it could not blow straight in. It had to navigate a descent, a low point, and a rise. And by the time any air completed that journey, it had slowed, mixed, and warmed against the tunnel's walls. Some designs included a deliberate pit at the tunnel's lowest point, a cold sink where the heaviest air drained and stayed frozen in place. Buffalo Birdwoman, a Hidatsa elder whose words were recorded by anthropologist Gilbert Wilson in the early 1900s, described winter nights this way. Frost would form thick on the entrance tunnel walls, but inside, near the fire, they slept warm. That frost was not a sign of failure. It was proof the system was working exactly as designed. The cold was being arrested at the boundary, crystallized into ice on the tunnel walls, held there by the physics of density and mass. While 10 feet away, families slept in warmth, and the fire was not even the primary heat source. Consider this: a human body at rest produces approximately 100 watts of thermal energy. 30 people living in a well-insulated earth lodge generated 3,000 watts continuously. the equivalent of 3 space heaters running without interruption, every hour of every night. The fire was supplemental, a boost to hold interior temperature at genuine comfort rather than mere survivability. The people themselves were the furnace. The earth was the insulation, and the structure held both of them together across generations. These earth lodges were not rebuilt every season. They were occupied year after year, sometimes century after century, on the same foundations. Archaeologists have found sites where the same floor plan was reconstructed repeatedly in the same location for hundreds of years. People sometimes interpret that as conservatism, as a failure to innovate. It was the opposite. When a design performs perfectly, you don't change it. You build it again, and again, and again, because it works in summer too. The same thick earth covering that held winter warmth inside, now blocking summer heat from entering, keeping interiors cool, while the plains above baked at 35 degrees Celsius. No seasonal modification, no compromise. The same structure, solving 2 opposite problems with one solution. That is not primitive. That is elegant. They didn't survive winter. They found the one place winter couldn't follow, below the surface, inside the planet's own warmth, where the ground remembered summer, even when the sky had forgotten it. And they built their world there. The Tipi solved winter for one family. The Earth Lodge solved it for one extended clan. But the Iroquois of the eastern woodlands faced a different scale of problem entirely, and they answered it with a structure that shouldn't have worked any better than the teepee looked like it would, and yet outperformed European technology by every measure that mattered. The Iroquois longhouse stretched 60 to 200 feet in length, 20 feet wide, 15 to 20 feet tall at the center ridge. Under a single-barrel vaulted roof of elm bark lived 8, 10, sometimes 12 separate family compartments, arranged down either side of a central corridor. 3 generations, multiple families, one structure, and winters where temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius and held there for months. The engineering problem this created was one that no single solution could touch. You cannot heat 200 feet of open corridor with one fire. Physics won't allow it. The heat dissipates, the far ends go cold, and the people sleeping there pay the price. So the Iroquois didn't try to heat the whole space from a single source. They distributed the problem until it disappeared. Fire pits ran down the central aisle, spaced every 20 to 25 feet. 4 fires, 6 fires, sometimes 8, each one shared by the 2 family compartments flanking it on either side, one to the left of the corridor and one to the right. The spacing was not casual, too close, and the smoke from multiple fires overwhelmed the ventilation. Too far apart, and cold gaps opened between heat zones. At 20 to 25 feet, the warmth from adjacent fires overlapped continuously, meaning that no matter where you stood in that longhouse, you were within effective range of at least one fire, and often 2. The building had no cold end. It had no dead zone. It was engineered as a continuous thermal corridor from one door to the other. Each fire had its own roof vent positioned directly above it. Removable bark panels that could be adjusted from fully open in mild weather to nearly closed during the worst storms. The barrel vault ceiling shape channeled rising heat and smoke upward along its curved surface toward those vents, and the convective currents generated by multiple fires working simultaneously pulled fresh air continuously through the entry doors at each end of the structure. The longhouse breathed as a whole, cold air entering low at the ends, warm air and smoke exiting high through the center vents. The entire 200-foot length functioning as a single integrated ventilation system. And the bark covering that sheathed the exterior provided more insulation than it appears to. Elm and cedar bark sheets were overlapped like roof shingles, each piece covering the joints of the layer below, so that rain and snow shed outward, while wind could not penetrate inward. Some construction used a double layer with an air gap between. The same dead air principle that made the Tipi liner so effective, now scaled to cover an entire building the length of 2 modern houses. French Jesuit missionaries who lived among the Iroquois in the 1600s sent detailed reports back to France, and those reports say the same thing, over and over, in different words. The interiors were too warm, not survivable, not adequate, too warm. Men accustomed to stone buildings with massive fireplaces, Men who had grown up in the finest heated structures European civilization could build stepped inside a bark-covered longhouse in the middle of a northeastern winter and had to remove layers of clothing. One account describes the air as unbearably hot. They complained about smoke as well, but they also recorded, with evident surprise, that the warmth exceeded their own architecture. They didn't solve the heating problem, they dissolved it by breaking it into 10 smaller problems, each one manageable, each one solved by a fire and a vent working in its own zone, all of them together creating something no single large fire could have achieved. Now pull back from the architecture for a moment, because threading through all three of these structures, the tipi, the earth lodge, the longhouse, is a set of smaller techniques so consistent across cultures and geographies that they reveal something deeper than regional adaptation. They reveal a shared philosophy. On the plains, where timber was scarce, dried buffalo dung was the primary fuel. Modern testing shows that herbivore dung delivers 50 to 70% of wood's heat energy by weight, but combusts more completely and produces less smoke, critical in an enclosed space. This wasn't gathering whatever was available. This was selecting fuel based on thermal performance, the same way an engineer selects materials based on their properties. In the eastern woodlands, oak and hickory were chosen for their slow, hot burn and long-lasting coal beds. Ash could be burned green without the choking smoke that plagued European hearths. Dead standing trees were preferred because they stayed dry on the inside, even through wet weather. Every choice was purposeful. Every choice reflected a body of accumulated knowledge about how different materials behaved under combustion. Across all of these cultures, fire was never allowed to die through the night. The technique for preventing this was to build a strong coal bed from hardwood, then bury it under ash, a layer of insulation that slowed combustion to nearly nothing without extinguishing it. In the morning, you pushed aside the ash cover, exposed the live embers, added tinder, and had fire within minutes, in freezing darkness without striking a single spark. The flame never truly went out. It was banked, stored, preserved across the hours of cold, like every other form of thermal energy in these systems, held carefully, released slowly, wasted not at all. River stones were heated at the fire's edge through the evening, then wrapped in hide and placed inside sleeping robes, providing 4 to 6 hours of radiant warmth through the body of the sleeper. Some groups buried heated stones beneath sleeping areas before laying the robes down, creating a bed warmer from stored thermal mass before the concept had a name in any European language. Every one of these techniques flows from the same source, the same understanding, the same principle that is so consistent across peoples, separated by thousands of miles, that it cannot be coincidence. It is conclusion. A small, constant fire inside an insulated space defeats a large, intermittent fire inside a leaky structure. Every time, without exception, large fires exhaust fuel rapidly, create temperature swings that the body must constantly adapt to, generate excessive smoke that poisons the air, and blast heat upward and outward where it does no good. Small fires, fed steadily, produce stable warmth, generate manageable smoke, consume modest fuel, and when combined with dead air insulation, or earth mass, or controlled convective loops, maintain genuine comfort indefinitely. Today's passive house designers in Scandinavia are reaching the same conclusion through calculation and computer modeling. They call it innovation. The people who built teepees and earth lodges and longhouses called it Tuesday. This was not a collection of tricks. This was thermodynamic philosophy, tested not in laboratories, but in the only testing environment that has ever truly mattered, one where failure meant you did not wake up in the morning. Go back to the beginning. Go back to those European fur traders stepping inside a structure made of buffalo hide and wooden poles in the dead of a northern plains winter, and reaching for their collar to loosen it because the interior was uncomfortably warm. You started this episode with that image as a paradox, something that didn't fit, something that demanded explanation. It fits now. The smoke flaps were positioned into the wind, creating a pressure differential that pulled air upward and out. The liner was holding a pocket of dead air against the outer wall, the same way a double-pane window holds it today. The fire was small, central, and constant, radiating equally in every direction into a circular space designed to receive it. The cold air entering at the bottom was feeding the combustion instead of fighting it. Every element was working. The traders weren't experiencing something mysterious. They were standing inside a system that had been refined across generations until it performed at a level that surprised everyone who encountered it from the outside. Because from the outside, it looked like it shouldn't work at all. Now ask yourself something honestly. What would you have to understand about physics, about air movement, about the behavior of fire, about the thermal properties of soil, about the density of cold air and the buoyancy of warm air, about how bark overlaps and how smoke rises, and how a tunnel's geometry can trap a column of freezing air in place by its own weight? What would you have to understand about all of that to keep 30 people genuinely warm for 5 months, using nothing but hide, wood, earth, and bark? Not to keep them alive, to keep them warm. That is the standard that was being met, season after season, generation after generation, long before the words thermal mass, or passive ventilation, or convective loop existed in any language. We spent centuries developing those words. We built universities to study the principles behind them. We ran experiments and published papers, and eventually arrived, through calculation and peer review, at conclusions that indigenous engineers had already encoded into their architecture before European contact. Thermal mass, dead air insulation, distributed heat sources, passive ventilation driven by pressure differentials, earth sheltering. We call these ideas sustainable architecture. We give them awards and certifications, and present them at conferences as advances. They were called home. Not a primitive home, not an adequate home. A home that made visitors from a civilization that considered itself the pinnacle of human development reach for their collar because they were too warm inside it. What was lost between then and now is not technology. Technology has only grown. What was lost is a particular kind of attention, the kind that comes from having no margin for error, from living in a place that will kill you if you misunderstand it, from being forced to listen to your environment so carefully and for so long that you stop fighting it and start thinking with it. These systems didn't emerge from genius. They emerged from necessity applied across generations. Every failure was corrected. Every success was kept. Every principle that worked was built into the next structure, and the one after that, until the knowledge became architecture, and the architecture became culture, and the culture carried the knowledge forward in the only form that truly lasts, not written down, but built, inhabited, and lived in every winter for hundreds of years. The cold never stopped. The wind never stopped. But neither did they, because they didn't fight the world they lived in. They listened to it, and what they heard, they built. If this episode changed how you see the past, if it made you look at a cone of hide or a mound of earth and see engineering instead of primitiveness, then subscribe to Primal Echoes. Because every episode, we go deeper, back into the cold, the dark, and the seemingly impossible, to ask the only question that has ever mattered. How did they actually do it?